Hello and welcome to Rules for Pro Whites. I want to talk about the difference between suicide versus genocide and why the crucial difference between those two words is vitally important when we talk about the ongoing invasion of Europe, the so-called migrant crisis. Now, if you watched a lot of YouTube videos on this subject, you may have heard a lot of well-meaning people who are rightfully and understandably outraged and angry at the ongoing invasion of Europe use the word suicide in relation to this subject quite a lot. You'll hear things like, oh, why is the West committing suicide? Why is the German people committing suicide? Why is Europe committing suicide? And so on, things like this. Well, I've got news for you. There is no suicide happening in Europe. What's happening in Europe is an act of genocide. It's a constructive act of genocide being carried out against the European people by a treasonous and treacherous European elite, an elite that is so hostile that actually decided to genocide their own indigenous populations of Europe for various reasons, maybe the reasons for another video. But that is a simple reality. Now, why is the difference between these two words so vitally important? Well, let me first explain the difference between the two words just briefly. I won't use a dictionary for this, I don't feel I have to, but quite simply, suicide is something that an individual, for whatever reason, decides to do to themselves. It's a private thing. It's your own personal decision. There may be many external or internal factors that drove you to take your own life, but it's ultimately something you voluntarily do to yourself. To the extent that if anybody else stood alongside you and watched you take your own life and didn't try to stop you or even talk you out of it, that person themselves could be in trouble with the law of the land for letting you take your own life and not trying to stop you in any way. Genocide, on the other hand, is something that is inflicted upon an entire group of people by some external power. It's not a personal thing, and you don't get to decide voluntarily whether or not you want to be part of the genocide. If you're part of the group being targeted for the genocide, you can't simply turn around to the authorities committing the genocide and say, I've had to think about it, leave me out of this one, I don't want any part of it. You don't get to make that choice. Likewise, if you actually try to speak out against the genocide happening and try to prevent it, you will likely find yourself in trouble by the authorities committing the genocide. Hence, if you're in Germany and you speak out too loudly against the ongoing invasion of Germany, you will find yourself in trouble with the German authorities who are committing the genocide against the German people. Very, very simple. Now, the difference between these two words and not calling it suicide, but calling it what it actually is, genocide, the reason this is so vitally important is that when you're under attack, you cannot even begin to think about defending yourself from that attack until you begin to finally understand that you actually are under attack. The ongoing invasion of Europe by non-European people is not something that's happening in a gigantic vacuum of coincidences and unfortunate circumstances. It is being done deliberately. And it's not being done by the Muslims. The Muslims are taking full advantage of it, that's understandable. But Muslims themselves are not powerful enough to decide to simply go ahead and invade Europe. If they were, it would have already happened centuries ago. This is our own European elite at the highest levels of politics, the media, the judiciary, legal systems, academia, etc., who are embarking on this policy of genocide against their own people. And they're using Muslims and various other non-European groups as a simple weapon against the indigenous people of Europe. It's being done deliberate. It has nothing to do with any empathy for people suffering in the third world. It's far easier to help people in the third world than it is to bring them into Europe and help them in Europe. For the amount of money it would cost to keep a so-called refugee in a country like Germany or Sweden, you could keep 10 or 20 people from that part of the world in that part of the world. The same amount of money would look after a lot more people, feed a lot more people, and bring protection to a lot more people, etc., etc. The powers that are committing this genocide against the European people, they are European, they're at the head of all European institutions, and they're not doing it because they care about Muslims or any other ethnic group for that matter. They're doing it to destroy their own indigenous populations. It's important to understand it because until you do, you can't begin to defend yourself against it. This is one reason. Another thing is, once you've understood that you are under attack, that it is genocide and not suicide, the next part is you have to understand who your true enemy is, who is actually attacking you. And believe it or not, it ultimately is not the Muslims. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're in a situation where you and or your family are personally directly threatened in some way, your first priority is to simply protect yourself from that threat. I get it. But simply speaking out against Muslims or even speaking out against the Muslim invasion of Europe in itself is actually counterproductive. It's not just pointless and useless, it's counterproductive. Let me explain why. If I was to bring a vicious dog into your home deliberately with the intention that that vicious dog is going to attack you and your family, of course your first priority is to defend yourself against the dog. But if you don't at some point identify my role in deliberately bringing that dog into your home, then you allow me to do two things. The first thing is you allow me to moralize over you. So I can sit back and say things like, oh, why are you so cruel to dogs? Why do you hate dogs so much? How do you know the dog was going to attack your children? If you hadn't been so violent and aggressive towards the dog, maybe the dog would have been friendly. How dare you attempt to put the dog outside on such a cold, wet night like this? Oh, why do you hate animals so much? I can moralize over you, and at the same time, next week I can bring two vicious dogs into your home. Or maybe three or four vicious dogs, maybe some vicious dogs and some other animals or whatever. Because if you're not identifying my role in this, I can A, moralize over you, and B, I can continue to do the same thing, more of the same, continuously over and over again, because you're not identifying my role in it. And this is why, whenever there's a Muslim terrorist attack in Europe or a mass sex attack or whatever, and people come out and speak out against the Muslims and their actions, the authorities across the media, across the political spectrums, get to sit back and A, moralize and say things like, well, maybe if we were more welcoming to Muslims, they wouldn't act this way, or why are you so intolerant against Muslims, etc., etc. And at the same time, they continue to bring more Muslims into your particular European country. It's the same principle, it's exactly the same thing. So A, you've got to identify under attack, B, you've got to know who's actually attacking you, who's behind it all, and three, you've got to identify all the methods being used by your attacker against you. Now, of course, the major one is the mass immigration of non-European people into all Western European countries. Of course it is, but there's other methods. A big part of this, which works hand in hand with a mass invasion, is assimilation. I hear a lot of, even I assume, well-meaning people say things like, oh, if only the Muslims, for example, could assimilate in Europe, or whatever particular non-European, non-white group it is. Well, this assimilation thing's a funny word, because if the numbers were minute enough, then assimilation would not necessarily be a bad thing. On a personal level, it's none of my business who you decide to marry and have children with. It's none of my business. But when you couple assimilation with mass non-European immigration into all European countries, this simply amounts to nothing less than the EU's final solution to the white problem. Assimilation combined with mass non-European immigration into Europe, when you follow it with assimilation, you're simply talking about the final nail in the coffin of European people. Quite simply, if you, for example, bring 1 million predominantly young single non-German men into Germany, this does not mean that suddenly 1 million young single white German women suddenly materialize to redress the balance. It simply means more and more men of all ethnic groups competing over the same number of German women. And ultimately, if all the invaders get to have a nice white German girl, ultimately in time, there'll be no more German people in Germany. If I can figure that out, you can be damn sure that all the professional politicians, all those highly educated, university-educated journalists in the news media, etc., etc., they understand this too and they know what they're doing. So, very simply, you must A, understand that you're under attack. You can't begin to defend yourself until you do that. You must B, understand who your true enemy is, who's actually behind the attack. While dealing with the immediate danger in front of you, ultimately you've got to know who's really behind it. And C, you've got to understand the methods being used. It is extremely counterproductive to call it suicide and not genocide. It's extremely counterproductive to complain endlessly about Muslims or any non-European group that doesn't belong in Europe instead of calling out the powers that be that are deliberately behind the invasion. And it is also counterproductive and actually downright dangerous to think of assimilation as the answer to the problem, when it's actually part of the EU's final solution to the white problem. It's part of the ongoing act of ultimate genocide against all European people in Europe. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.